Hi, I'm Kristen Brandt, and today we're going to talk about agricultural production regions. Those of you that have tuned into some of my videos already maybe are used to a little quirky behavior, but also starting with a mental map. So let's start there. I need you to picture South America. It's a pretty big continent. Okay, let's narrow it down. Definitely want to be in an area that is hot, it's humid. Might also be an area where I'm exposed to a lot of animals. It might also be an area where I am slashing and I'm burning. I'm growing some crops, but then I'm going to move on once the nutrients are depleted out of that soil. If you are able to put me in the Amazon rainforest, then you're right on track here. What we're going to start talking about is that practice of shifting cultivation and where that fits with the economic influence of commercial and subsistence agricultural practices. So come on with me. Today, what are we going to learn? We need to make sure we're on the same page, or what are some of those defining characteristics between subsistence versus commercial agriculture. So we first look at purpose, okay? So really the difference here is when we talk about commercial agriculture, we're talking about crops that are grown for profit, cash, money. Versus subsistence, the purpose is to provide food for family and community. Doesn't mean they never make any money or there's no exchange, but the primary purpose is to provide substance. Okay, so purpose. But there's got to be more that helps distinguish the difference between these two. We want to look at the percentage of workers that are employed as farmers. So if you remember back to when we were talking about the second agricultural revolution, we talked about the use also of machines and the number of farmers that maybe were also needed to work on those plots of land. So what we see in commercial agriculture, a smaller percentage of workers are actually employed as farmers. Why? We don't need as many because of the use of machines on that farm. So we're going to explore that with some examples in a little bit. We also talk about farm size. Typically with commercial agriculture, we're going to find really large farms. Average farm size in the United States is a little over 400 acres. Okay, I'm not going to lie. I had to look up what is an acre kind of compared to. If you can picture a football field with the end zones as well, that's a little over an acre, like 1.3-ish. Subsistence farmers, on the other hand, much smaller in size, going to be than that 400 acres. And so maybe you're talking 1-2 acres, just enough to help provide food for the family and community. And then finally, at the very end, we want to take a look at what is the relationship of the type of agriculture to other businesses. And what we find is with commercial agriculture, things are really entwined. And so we'll explore that as we kind of look through some examples. So let's get it started. That workforce that is employed in agriculture. What trends do you notice when you look at the map? The darker the colors, the higher percentages. Do you notice that most of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, look at how dark those areas of shades of purple those areas are. And what we see is that those areas are going to have higher numbers of people employed in agriculture. Take a look, compare the United States in 2009, 0.7% of our population was the labor force was engaged in agriculture. Versus look at India, 47%. We come over to Guatemala in Latin America, 31.4%. And then even right down here in Mozambique, 74.4%. Now go back to some discussions that we've had about more developed and less developed countries. Core, periphery. You should see that those higher numbers are going to be in those higher numbers of labor force engaged in agriculture are going to be in your less developed or your periphery countries. Let's take a look at types of machines. Look at the image to your left. When I look at this map, take a look at the darker red, the more machines that are used, in particular tractors here, compared to arable land. Hopefully you remember arable land. That's our land that's farmable. And so when we look at that, we really look at, again, the haves versus have-nots. Take a look at that image to the right of all of those machines out to harvest at the same time. I just think this image is beautiful. But what you're seeing is, first of all, a lot of money. Those are not cheap machines, but look at how much they can harvest at one time. If I counted each of those, what are those 20 people that it would be that are needed to do that? Look how big the field is. The more that we rely on machines and the more tractors that we see, typically, again, this is going to be our core or our developed countries. How about farm size? Farm size is also an indicator of commercial or subsistence farming. And so if you look at the graph on the left, what you're seeing is farms and the average size from 1850 to 2017. And so when we take a look at the number of farms, we start to see them decrease, but yet we're seeing the farm size increase. Commercialization. I don't need as many people owning individual farms if I'm using machines. Take a look at the vast farm on the right. Take a look at how wide that is. It feels like it just keeps going on and on. One person could own and farm all of that land. So how does all of that connect to productivity? When we talk about productivity, what we're talking about is the amount of effort or labor that's put into actually growing these crops versus actually how much is being produced. So because of all the technologies and advancements that have happened in agriculture, with commercial agriculture, it allows us to produce more with less people, with less labor. And so with that, we see a lot of growth within our commercial agriculture and not needing as many farms, just bigger farms. That being said, subsistence farming is not going to look like this. Subsistence farming is going to have a lot of labor. It is going to have a lot of investment, and you're not going to see the same output and the same returns. Why does that matter? Because ultimately, we're talking about how we're connected to a lot of different things. And we see this in relationship to other businesses. And so in particular, the word agribusiness. When we talk about agribusiness, what we're talking about is how agriculture is connected to other aspects. It could be connected to the market, the seeds, the machines that we're talking about. It's everything that goes into buying the land, to planting the seeds, to growing, to selling, to market, and then transforming it into something that we'll even use on our everyday lives. Subsistence farming is not connected like that. Subsistence farming is much more family, individual, small community based, and that idea of the connection to the land is for that community, that family. So let's practice. Production of agricultural products destined primarily for direct consumption by the producer rather than for market. If you said C, you're correct. What should we take away? I need you to take away the economic differences, okay, between these two types of agriculture. When it comes down to it, purpose. One is for money, one's not. When it comes down to the types of crops, we're growing crops for money with commercial agriculture. Subsistence, we are growing crops for our family or our community. It takes money to pay for those machines. Commercial agriculture is going to more heavily invest in the more advanced machines. Subsistence is going to rely more on hands. Land use. Commercial agriculture is going to have the ability to farm more land and produce more with the productivity, with less labor, versus subsistence, which typically relies on smaller plots of land and is going to require more labor. We're going to explore different types of subsistence and commercial agriculture in future daily lessons. I hope you join us for future lessons. Hi, I'm Kristen Brandt, and today we're going to be talking about agricultural production regions. This is our second video in this series. The first video, we really explored the difference between subsistence and commercial agriculture. And today we really want to look at the economic forces and how they influence intensive and extensive farming practices. But before you know me, I want to start with a little bit of mental mapping. So I want you to picture a state in the United States where you might find, I don't know, they're known for cheese, cows, milk, the Packers. Well, if you got to Wisconsin, that's right. That's where I actually grew up. And believe it or not, my experiences growing up in northern Wisconsin actually will connect to today's lesson. So let's dive right in. What are we going to learn? So the first thing is we need to understand the difference between intensive farming and extensive farming. When we talk about intensive farming, what we're talking about is the amount of money or labor that we invest into this. So sometimes it's money that we spend on fertilizers and other materials to make our products thrive, or the amount of labor and effort that goes into it to produce the goods. But it's greater than the amount of land that we're using. And a lot of times that's because the land is actually more expensive, or it is because of the purpose of the type of farming that we're doing. I'll get into that more in just a little bit. Versus extensive. So traditionally, it was less money that was invested. I'm not paying as much money for labor. I'm not having to use as much labor compared to the amount of land that I'm using. So this is one that's kind of evolved and gets a little bit tricky as we move through our examples. Hopefully it'll become clear. But really at this point, think lots of land for extensive, and the amount of labor or money that I'm putting into it is less than what I would see in intensive. The examples I think will help make it clear. And what we're going to look at is we're going to constantly come back to how much land are we using, and then how much labor is involved, or the amount of money that we're spending to actually produce those goods. Both of these, intensive and extensive, can be considered subsistence and commercial. So let's go back to what we talked about in the first video. We have to come back to what's the economic purpose. If it's for cash, then we're going to be talking commercial. If it's for your family or your community, that's the primary purpose, then it's subsistence. Economic input, commercial, typically we have more money to spend on investing in machinery. We're going to use more land. Versus subsistence, the economic input typically is going to be smaller, a lot more manual labor. So let's dive into some examples here in just a minute to see what we mean by that. But first, there's another theory I want to introduce you to, which will become important in our lessons about von Thunen's model in 5.6. And that's this idea of bid rent. See where the market is located, or the town. Land cost is going to be super expensive the closer we are to town. The further I move away from town, the cheaper the land gets. So this goes back to that idea of the difference between intensive and extensive. Intensive, typically we're going to spend a little bit more money because we need to maybe be closer to town as well. Extensive, we're going to use more land. I'm not going to have to spend as much money because I'm going to be further from town. And so that's this idea of figuring out those economic factors that are going to influence our intensive and extensive farming practices. Let's look at some examples that will help us to further understand the difference between intensive and extensive farming. I know it can get a little complicated. Take a look at this image. Take a look at the words. I'm not going to lie, the first thing I try to figure out is subsistence. How do I know that what is happening here? What's the purpose? Okay, this is pastoral nomads. So clearly what's happening here, the products that are being produced here are for either the individuals, but in this case, most likely the community. How do I know it's extensive? Look at the amount of land. That's going to help us to determine that this is extensive subsistence. So how does that differ than extensive commercial? Think about ranching. Take a look at this. Still a lot of land, but the purpose is different. These cattle here, the primary purpose is probably for meat, beef. What's for dinner? So that idea of using the land, extensive, but for profit, is going to give us extensive commercial. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Notice that I put both up here. So the first answer on the back half here, commercial, we should be able to recognize this from previous lessons. We can see machines, we can see large plots of land. We know that the purpose here is not just to feed an individual or a small community. We can say that this is definitely for profit and a commercial farming practice. When I look at extensive versus intensive, I would say that traditionally this has been extensive. Look at the wide amount of land. The difference is over time, there have been some intensive practices that have occurred here, such as it's expensive to use tractors and machinery. If they're using heavy fertilizers, if they're using heavy pesticides. So we would need a little more information to clearly determine which one is going on here. I would say make sure you talk to your teachers and see what your teachers are recommending. Little more info would help us to really nail down which one's happening here. So what do we got going on here? Well, one, I'm trying to introduce you to a new crop, maybe. So this is cassava. And what's happening here is that this woman is harvesting by hand. So typically what we would need to know that if it's by hand, we're probably talking subsistence and we're probably talking intensive. Smaller plots for the individual, for the community. Lots of labor. So then what would we say is intensive commercial? We've got a couple different options. So one, if you've ever visited a farmer's market, you might actually see some intensive commercial. People typically are going to put a lot of labor of love into these. A lot of them are going to be organic. And so we're going to take a lot more work to produce these goods. Also, the primary purpose is commercial, so it is for profit. The other thing when we talk intensive, the land is probably more expensive because they're not using those same type of preservatives or chemicals, and so they're going to spend the money on the land to be closer to the markets, which is going to help make it intensive commercial. Little fun fact, we're going to talk more about those concepts when we talk about Von Thunen in 5.8. I said I was going to come back to Wisconsin. Intensive commercial, dairy farming. So here we see that the cows are being milked. Definitely commercial farming. Commercial farming here for profit. Where it's intensive is in its labor. There is a lot of energy that is put into dairy farming and compared to sometimes that routine. Cows need to be milked on a regular basis, 7 days a week. There's no days off. Learned this firsthand. One of my friends from high school, her parents own a dairy farm in northern Wisconsin, and it was difficult to take vacations because you'd have to find people that were willing to help milk those cows. Cows and milking don't take time off. So let's practice. What type of question might be asked on an AP exam? So this is an FRQ. And we're not going to go into all the different free response questions, but if you'll notice, I didn't mention anything about shifting cultivation. But that idea of describing a practice. So you could describe intensive farming practices. In order to get the points here with shifting cultivation, which we will talk about in other videos throughout this unit, you would have to know that there are many steps to it. This idea, you have to clear the land. Often your teachers will talk about slash and burn to clear that land. Then we're going to farm it for a short period of time, typically small plots of land. When we've depleted all those soils, then we're going to shift and we're going to move to another location. What does that sound like? Small plots of land, lots of labor. Sounds pretty intensive to me. So what should we take away? Put a chart up here to kind of help to organize thoughts. And so we threw a lot at you in a short amount of time. So when you look at intensive subsistence, intensive commercial, extensive subsistence, and extensive commercial, go back to what's the purpose? Is it for local consumption or is it for profit? How about the amount of labor? When we're talking intensive, typically that is when it is really high. Extensive tends to be a little more minimal. How about financial investment? Notice this one gets a little bit tricky when we talk about subsistence. Subsistence is a lot of manual labor, but both extensive commercial and intensive commercial, we're going to see some heavy investment. Amount of land, we know that typically intensive is going to be more on smaller plots of land and extensive is going to be on larger plots of land. I hope this helped clear this up for you. And hopefully you're going to have questions that you can explore with your teacher. And I look forward to seeing you in future daily videos.